Families are paying over $2 per litre at the pump today, which is increasing costs and inflation across the supply chain. It's one of the reasons interest rates has increased, which is hurting working Australians immensely. Fuel prices will go up and down, but a cut to fuel excise would lower costs and reduce inflation now. Why won't the government reduce the fuel excise at a time it has a budget surplus and provide instant cost of living and mortgage relief to families, especially in Western Sydney?
So there we have Dai Le, the member for Fowler, calling out the government and Anthony Albanese in particular, especially noting the petrol prices have remained stubbornly, persistently high. They are simply remaining higher for longer, much like the cost of everything in Australia. She suggested that the fuel excise, which is the tax the government charges on petrol, should be cut, at least temporarily, thereby helping to relieve cost of living pressures for many Australians, directly for consumers who would see a reduction in their petrol price, but also via businesses, who would now have their own costs reduced, thereby reducing their need to pass on the costs to consumers. But the question, of course, is, would cutting the fuel excise actually make a difference? Or would it just cause people to shift their spending from petrol onto something else? Let's have a look at this, and if you've got any thoughts about whether the fuel excise should be cut or not, well, let me know that in the comments below. Well, the fuel excise is currently 48.8 cents per litre. It's indexed with inflation every 6 months. It will increase as the price of everything else increases. It directly increases the cost of filling your car. It adds 48.8 cents per litre when you fill up your car at the petrol station. Now, it obviously makes things a little bit more expensive. In an ideal world where nothing else moves, if you cut the fuel excise, then petrol prices will go down 48.8 cents per litre. That won't necessarily happen, but that's at least the logic behind an excise cut. Now, cutting the fuel excise would be immediately disinflationary. We can see that if fuel prices go down 48.8 cents per litre, well, then fuel prices have decreased, which would alleviate inflation, at least to some extent. It would immediately reduce the cost of fuel. But we do need to consider, what about the implications of that price cut? Because if we're going to cut the fuel excise, which would be nice, if it's just made up for when price increases elsewhere, well then maybe it won't actually achieve the purpose it was set out to do. However, as I'll illustrate, there are probably a few reasons to think an excise cut might in fact be a good idea. First, we have to ask ourselves, will the cut simply result in more demand for fuel, thereby pushing the price back to where it was regardless? That is, if you cut the fuel price by 48.8 cents per litre, will people just demand more fuel, which therefore under supply and demand just drives the price back up? However, I regard this as relatively unlikely. Demand for fuel is what we'd regard as somewhat inelastic. That is, the demand for fuel, at least at a point, doesn't significantly respond to price changes. Now granted, there will be some response. People might drive more or less based on fuel prices. However, there's always a baseline level of commuting that we need to do. People always need to deliver goods from A to B. You need to go to work, you need to pick up the kids, you need to do various other things that require fuel. A lot of the demand for fuel is effectively inelastic. It's things that people can't avoid. It is not discretionary. Therefore, unless we seriously think that people are going to respond to a cut in fuel by doing a lot more discretionary driving, I think it's unlikely that the price cut will actually push up demand for fuel, at least push it up significantly. Maybe a little bit, but certainly not by as much as the fuel excise cut. And it should also note at this point that the price you see at the petrol station isn't really determined by domestic supply and demand necessarily. More, it's determined by international fuel prices, and petrol stations charge what they think they can get away with. And this leads me to the role of the ACCC. It's been argued, potentially, that if there's a fuel excise cut, then the petrol stations will simply increase their prices commensurate with the cut, thereby leaving the prices that you see completely unchanged. However, this is why the ACCC exists. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission would come in and stop price gouging of that nature, or at least they should. After all, when the fuel excise was cut during the pandemic, the ACCC came in to stop the petrol stations pocketing that cut. They came in to stop the petrol stations fleecing consumers. One would expect the same thing would happen here if the excise were cut yet again. However, of course, this would require the regulator to be vigilant. And therefore, it's unlikely to my mind that a fuel excise cut is just going to result in the price remaining the same due to supply and demand. Second, the price cut will implicitly give more money to consumers. It's sometimes argued that if they get this money, then they might spend this money on other things, thereby just triggering inflation somewhere else in the economy. You might get disinflation in fuel, but you get inflation somewhere else. However, to some extent, this is the same argument with any form of disinflation. It basically means you can never have prices go down in anything, because then people will take that saving and spend it elsewhere. Arguing against an excise cut is basically like arguing against any price cut. It's basically saying a sale, which could be disinflationary, is then going to trigger more inflation that would more than offset it. This argument appears to suggest that cutting the fuel excise is pointless, as it would simply push people to spend money elsewhere in the economy, thereby pushing up inflation. Or rather, the only cure for high prices is high prices and the impact that they'd have on crunching demand. The issue to some extent is when you look at who demands that fuel, and it's not just aggregate demand we're necessarily interested in here, but who is demanding it, and how they'd respond to this price cut on petrol. Now, I imagine that in the consumer sector, the biggest users of fuel are probably families, possibly in the outer suburbs, possibly with longer commutes. I imagine the people in the inner city, who are generally more affluent, probably have better public transport and are probably driving a little bit less than people in the suburbs with families. Therefore, the main beneficiaries of the excise cut are probably going to be people who are struggling more with the inflation at the moment. And therefore, they're the type of people who might take this price cut and try to put the money into expenditures they were otherwise foregoing that they really need to be spending money on, or alternatively just trying to build up a small savings buffer for when interest rates get higher and higher. After all, if the person is struggling to pay their mortgage, then they're going to use this excise cut to actually pay back that mortgage or pay off their debts. And therefore, it isn't immediately apparent that the excise cut would necessarily just lead to inflation elsewhere in the economy. Now, to be clear, I do not believe that this should be the basis of setting policy more broadly. We should not set policy based on institutionalizing wealth transfers. However, since demand has become a mattering issue, it's worth considering how the excise cut would actually affect that demand. And I don't see that cutting the excise is going to dramatically worsen inflation elsewhere. Third, we need to consider what the price cut will do to government spending. Now, government spending oftentimes again is a little bit inelastic. The government spends like a drunken sailor whether or not they have the money. If they don't have the money coming in from revenue, they might just go out and borrow. However, in theory anyway, if the government is acting responsibly, when they get lower revenue, they might cut some of their spending, especially in discretionary areas that aren't really that necessary, especially in programs that are going to build in a structural deficit. The government might be forced to take a critical glimpse at what it is spending the money on. Therefore, reducing the government's money might force some degree of fiscal restraint. At the moment, the government has a budget surplus, and therefore fiscal restraint right now makes a lot of sense. The government is making a lot of money, but other people are not. So this excise cut could incrementally reduce the amount of money the government would have bringing in, at least temporarily if the excise cut is temporary. And therefore, it would reduce the government's ability to engage in wantonly inflationary expenditure, or at least it might deter some of this. This is important because the government's infrastructure build-out has been seen as being directly inflationary. It's something that the IMF and the RBA and the Australian Financial Review have specifically noted. The government is actively contributing to inflation with its expenditure on various projects, not all of which are necessarily going to be productive. Because when the government goes out and spends money on infrastructure, it drives up demand for goods. So, for example, for concrete or for timber or various other things that are needed for construction, which drives up the cost of building everything else, which is part of the reason we get a lack of housing supply, because the cost of building houses has now gone up. It also drives up the cost of labour, because now the government is demanding all of the construction workers. It drives up the cost of debt, because now the government is borrowing more money potentially to fund these infrastructure projects, which therefore results in debt becoming more expensive just due to supply and demand. The government spending more and more money effectively contributes to inflation. Therefore, the government perhaps having some fiscal restraint forced upon it by reducing the incremental revenue every year, or at least incremental revenue temporarily, could therefore help to alleviate inflation by getting some government spending under control. Now, to be clear, government spending can be beneficial if it is productive. However, I don't think anyone believes that all the government's infrastructure projects are in fact productive. I think a lot of people can realise that the infrastructure projects are often boondoggles that the politicians are throwing out there to try to curry favour with the electorate in that particular location to try to get some more votes. Something that could ultimately backfire if those projects are driving up inflation. It's the type of short-sighted politicking that is not necessarily beneficial either to the politicians when it catches up with them or to the voters. And therefore, imposing some restraint on the government might in fact be beneficial. The government, however, appears locked into a lot of these spending projects. They appear not to really want any fiscal restraint. However, maybe an incremental stimulus to get them there might in fact be beneficial. The government also appears to be locked into this Greens anti-petrol agenda. They appear to not want to do anything that would reduce the cost of fuel, even though it would appear that the coalition would also support this and they could easily get it through both the House and the Senate. It appears the government just wants to curry favour with the Greens and the left, and it's unlikely they'd actually want to do an excise cut because of the signal it would send about petrol spending, even though it is patently unrealistic to expect people to transition to EVs at the time when everything else is expensive and people aren't super keen on going out and buying a new vehicle. Nevertheless, it's possibly something the government should be considering. There is, however, a caveat in this whole discussion: the role of consumption taxes. The government must derive revenue from somewhere, otherwise it can't go out and spend any money. This might be from income taxes or consumption taxes or from land taxes. The problem, however, is we have all of these and they all keep increasing. We've got income taxes that keep increasing due to bracket creep because those brackets are not indexed, so a greater proportion of your income keeps getting taxed at a higher marginal rate. We've got land taxes levied at the state level on investment properties. These keep increasing because the percentage goes up, like in Victoria, or because the land value is revalued upwards, so the state government can grab yet more revenue. Consumption taxes exist via things like the GST or the fuel excise. Now, personally, I prefer consumption taxes. I'd rather have a higher GST and lower income taxes, or a higher GST and indexed brackets for tax rates. However, the government seems to want everything. It seems to want more money from more sources, ever more and more money, to spend more and more money on boondoggles, on things that help the government politically, but aren't necessarily productive. To my mind, the government needs a serious look at how it is actually spending its money to get itself under control. But in the short term, doing something about fuel excises could be beneficial, at least as a temporary measure so we can get inflation under control and then get things starting heading back down toward normal. Because high inflation is a tax on everyone's standard of living. But do let me know your thoughts about whether the fuel excise should be cut either temporarily or permanently. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But personally, I do think that Dai Le raises an interesting point. I think it's something that needs to be considered seriously, and the government really needs to be taking it on board. And if the government is not going to cut the fuel excise, they need to come up with a credible, truthful answer for why they aren't doing so, and they need to level with voters about what they actually intend to do to get on top of the ever-increasing costs of everything. But nevertheless, like I said, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And otherwise, thanks a lot for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I see you next time as well.